Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. My name is Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist, philosopher, and political theorist. And in this video, I'm going to begin the first of three videos that do a survey of some of the themes in Chapter 8 of my new book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. This chapter is the war on cancer. And I know that this is a topic that probably has impacted, if not personally, the family and friends that most of my audience will have in one form or another, and it certainly has impacted my own family life. And so I'm going to talk about the war on cancer, the success story, but also the severe limitations that we face in trying to eradicate cancer if we ignore the role of biological aging in how it makes us more vulnerable to cancer in late life. So globally, every year about 10 million people die from cancer. This is a breakdown from the World Health Organization into the different geographical regions in which cancer mortality. And you can see Asia has over 5 million cancer deaths every year. And so here's a short video with the theme music on the war against disease that Charles Winslow championed, that was then applied to cancer. And I'll reflect on some of the challenges that we have faced in a 100-year war against cancer. The war against cancer has been waged for over a century. All right, so just a personal note, as I mentioned, cancer has impacted my own family's life. Both of my parents were impacted by cancer or cancer treatment in the last few years of their life. My book is dedicated to my parents, who were very supportive throughout my career and life. And I talked about many of the topics of this book with my parents. Both of them were nurses, so they were very informed about preventative medicine. And as they got older, we talked frankly about some of the challenges that they faced. In a previous social media appearance, I did a TEDx talk a few months after my father had passed away, where I share the connection, the personal connection between cancer mortality and trying to tackle aging itself. So that video is available online. And my mother endured over 14 years of chemotherapy. While she didn't have cancer, she had a cancer-like condition. And we talked candidly about the impact that had on the quality of life of having to manage that condition for such a long period of time. So this is a topic, the argument that I make is informed not only by my academic research, but my own lived observational experience of seeing how the war on cancer is played out in practice for individual patients. I plan to do like I do for most chapters. I'm going to break things down into three shorter videos. This first one is an introduction, especially to the politicalization of science and President Nixon's war on cancer, launched in 1971. In the second video, I'm going to offer some reflections on the lessons that we can learn from smoking and obesity, which are modifiable risk factors but have proven to be intractable. And then finally, I will anticipate some of the objections that the critic may make against the argument that I deploy throughout the book. All right, if you recall from chapter 4, this book is really concerned with the role of imagination, both within science and in bioethics and philosophical discussions of translational science more generally. And the war on cancer allows us to go a little bit more in depth, because that actually is an aspiration that has been invoked for many decades, and there's some important lessons that we can learn from both its success as well as its setbacks. Imagination is important both in the scientific enterprise, so what is it that medical science is trying to do? And when we think about the policy options available to us, what is it we're aspiring to achieve and how best can we get there, whether it be through changing the environment, focusing on lifestyle changes, or trying to develop drugs that will modulate our biology to help protect us from infectious or chronic disease. Imagination, if we recall from previous videos, is the capacity to mentally transcend time, place, or circumstance, to think about what might have been, to plan and anticipate the future, create fictional worlds, and consider remote and close alternatives to actual experiences. And throughout this book, I try to invoke our imagination about what the future would look like if we slowed aging to increase health span and compress disease, frailty, and disability in late life. But our minds often gravitate towards what I call the Frankensteinification of translational gerontology. That is, we conjure up, like Mary Shelley does with Victor Frankenstein's creature, imaginary harms and ignore the potential societal benefits from translational science. Now, when it comes to the war on cancer, I think there's an interesting contrast that we can draw between the way our imagination is typically invoked with respect to the war on cancer versus targeting biological aging itself. And so this is the contrast I want to deploy for this chapter, is the role of imagination in thinking about eradicating cancer, and then contrast that with the way we typically think about trying to deploy medical science to target aging itself. Now, at the top of the iceberg on cancer, I have a snow angel. We typically take this to be a morally desirable state of affairs. Imagine a world where no child would ever develop cancer, and we would save the 10 million people every year who die from cancer mortality. And then on the iceberg of aging, I have the shadow of Frankenstein, where we conjure up imagined harms of whether it be overpopulation, ecological disaster, of slowing down human aging. But one of the things that we don't think about when we think about a cancer-free world is the reality that removing cancer mortality would not necessarily confer sizable health dividend on older populations, because they're also going to be vulnerable to other more debilitating conditions as they age. This is being pointed out by the demographer J. Olshansky, for example, that Alzheimer's disease will become much more prevalent in a world where there's no cancer mortality for those individuals living through their late 70s and into their 8th decade of life. This is not something that we would typically imagine when we think about a cancer-free world. We envision people would just survive decades more of healthy life. But that ideal is folk biology. It's not predicated on what we know about the biology of aging and the onset of multimorbidity in late life. So the goal of this chapter is to allow us to develop a little bit more intellectual humility about what the war against disease could actually achieve, and supplement that ideal by shifting more of our resources, energy, and aspirations to targeting the rate of biological aging itself. Right. Now, one of the great gems that I came across in my research for this book was The Conquest of Cancer, published by H.W.S. Wright, all the way back in 1925. So over 100 years ago, he begins by making this bold pronouncement about what could be achieved already at the time that he was living if there was the political will to try to eradicate cancer. The cure of cancer is now ceasing to become a purely medical problem to be solved by biologists, pathologists, and surgeons, and is becoming a problem in psychology and education to be solved by publicists, schoolmasters, and perhaps, when enough people are alive to the facts of the situation, by legislators and statesmen. This may sound a bold thing to say, but I hope to be able to bring forward evidence proving that it is at present possible to cure 75% of cancer cases with a mortality of under 5%. Right? So a bold proclamation made over a century ago, but it really amplifies how the war against disease politicized science, and we're going to see this become much more evident when I talk about the war against cancer launched by Nixon in 1971. Now, Vannevar Bush also had a great contribution to this politicalization of science. FDR asked him to conceptualize what the scientific capital of the war against disease would look like as the Second World War was coming to a conclusion. He wrote a letter to Bush, and I'll just quote what he said: with particular reference to the war of science against disease, what can be done now to organize a program for continuing in the future the work which is being done in medicine and related science? So Roosevelt went on to point out that the death toll from one or two of the leading causes of death far exceeded the total of U.S. lives lost in World War II, and that we owe, as a matter of intergenerational justice, to invest in science to reduce those mortality risks. Now, we find this most evident in the early 1970s when President Nixon declares a war against cancer. He asked Congress for $100 million to invest in an aggressive aspiration to eradicate cancer. Nixon asked for an additional $100 million for the war against cancer, and the Fort Detrick was converted from a place that was devoted to campaigning against the infectious diseases to now target cancer itself. And we can see a whole bunch of attempts to articulate publicly the aspiration of eradicating cancer. The challenge goal for the National Cancer Institute hoped that cancer, could be eradicated from. There was iterations both in 2003 and 2008 with the goal of eradicating cancer by 2015. And when that goal, unfortunately, was not achieved, the 21st Century Cures Act was brought in. So again, I'm not disputing how morally laudable the goal of trying to eradicate cancer is, but rather to recognize that this is a particularly challenging endeavor to pursue in an aging world. So in this chapter, I highlight two important lessons for public health. I have this tortoise sticking its head out of the shell, and these are critically important for public health to recognize so that we see the ideal of rate control as actually very relevant to trying to prevent the onset of cancer in late life, though not necessarily eradicating cancer. That first lesson is that some of the modifiable behavior risk factors for cancer, like smoking and obesity, have proved to be very intractable, right? And so the first lesson is to recognize the limits of behavior control, that just trying to get people to change their behavior is not going to be sufficient for insulating us against some of the risk factors for cancer and other diseases. So this involves like some humility about how much we can expect human behavior to be changed. That's not to say we give up on the aspiration of behavior control, but to recognize that it's not going to be sufficient by itself. And I'll elaborate on that more in the second video when I talk about smoking and obesity, which are related in particular to cancer risk. And the second lesson that's really critical for the steamship of public health is that the most significant risk factor for cancer and for most other chronic conditions is one's chronological age, right? Most cancer is developed later in life. I have this statistic here from the Siegel piece. The probability of developing all cancers within the first 5 decades of life is only 1 in 29, but this rises to 1 in 3 by age 70. So for the future health of aging populations, it is imperative that biomedical research aspire to make the most important cancer risk factor, biological aging a modifiable risk factor. And so the second lesson is recognizing the significance of rate control. So the two messages combined are to help public health recognize the importance of humility, that modifiable risk factors may not actually be as modifiable as we might have hoped them to be. And things that were once conceptualized as unmodifiable may become modifiable, right? So to have both ambition and humility, this is a kind of paradoxical stance that I argue public health, the steamship of modern public health, has to adopt both ambition and humility in navigating through the perils of the ocean of longevity as populations survive past the 7th decade of life. Now, when we look at all-cause mortality in the United States, we see the impact that aging has. If you look at the different age cohorts here, per 100,000, when we look at early life, it's very rare for a child to die in the United States, for example, before they reach adulthood. You do have all age-specific rates of mortality for ages 15 to 19, for example, 2.7 children for every 100,000. But as you get beyond the 7th decade of life, you see a big jump. And this jump, many of the causes of mortality in this age cohort reflect the declining force of evolution by natural selection, that the biological warranty period or the health span of the human species diminishes as we get past the 7th decade of life. And this is manifest in the onset of cancer, heart disease, stroke, and Alzheimer's. So this is not just a coincidence. This is a reflection of how the force of evolution by natural selection declines with age. And so as we've abated those extrinsic risk factors that historically led to much higher mortality rates in early life, our attention must now shift towards the intrinsic risk factors, namely the biology of aging and how that implicates our health risks to the onset of the chronic conditions of later life. This war against disease has real implications for the allocation of funding for biomedical research. I've already pointed this out in an earlier video. If you compare the National Cancer Institute with the National Institute on Aging, you see that cancer, even though cancer becomes much more prevalent among older populations, aging itself receives only a small share of the research funding compared to cancer. And then one could add in Alzheimer's disease and you would get a similar story. So the war against cancer has led to a division of resources that has prioritized the goal of eradicating cancer rather than the goal of trying to slow aging itself, which would be an effective way of preventing the onset of many cancers. So just to return to this juxtaposition then between these two aspirations, at the moment we've had a century of aggressive pursuit of trying to eradicate cancer. Aging has only in the last decade or two become a feasible scientific aspiration to pursue. As we begin to pursue it more aggressively, I believe it will yield a much more significant health dividend for aging populations compared to what would be achieved if we could, though I think it's unlikely, eradicate all the 200 plus types of cancers that are responsible for mortality in the world today. What's fascinating about focusing on aging is that we actually see there are exemplar examples of healthy aging that offer some resistance to cancer, both in humans and non-human species. So the piece that I have here cited from the Critical Reviews in Oncology point out that actually among centenarians, cancer mortality is relatively rare. All right, so if you are of one of these rare individuals that will surpass age 100, it's probably the case that you have some enhanced biological resilience to cancer, and that's why sequencing the genome of centenarians and supercentenarians has been so critical to translational gerontology for helping us understand how these superagers have the additional protection against not only cancer, but many of the other common diseases responsible for mortality in the 7th and 8th decade of life. And similarly with the naked mole rat, which has a very significant lifespan exceeding 28 years of life, they seem to be resistant to cancer. So the puzzle of exceptional healthy aging may actually offer, solving that puzzle may offer new solutions to tackling cancer itself. So this concludes this first video on Nixon's war against cancer. I'll be elaborating a little bit more on some of the themes I emphasized here. We're going to do a deeper dive into smoking and obesity and that first lesson that I emphasized that the steamship of public health must address.